My next guest on the Quantum Shift podcast is someone whose work and whose presence stays with you long after the conversation ends. Dr. Andre Walton is a social psychologist, TEDx speaker, best-selling author, and one of the most thoughtful voices we have on creativity, emotional intelligence, and the neuroscience of human potential. He's a visiting professor of creativity and entrepreneurship and the author of the influential Harvard Business Review piece, Resolving the Paradox of Group Creativity, a study that has reshaped the way leaders think about collaboration, belonging, as well as innovation. But beyond the credentials, Andre has the rare ability to make complex neuroscience feel human, personal, and profoundly hopeful. In our time together, we explored why our childhood way of thinking might be exactly what we need to survive adulthood, how to move from stress to possibility, and what it truly means to reclaim the wide-angle lens of the mind. This is one of the most meaningful conversations I've had on the show, and I'm honored to share it with you. Enjoy. All right. So for people meeting you for the first time, how do you describe the journey that led you here?
Wow, that's complicated. Actually, everything about my life is complicated. I've spent many, many years trying to take simple situations and making them as complicated as possible. um, that's part of the key to what got me here. I suppose, firstly, there are three strands of my DNA, really. One is creativity. That really starts at birth. Both my parents were very, very creative, although I didn't actually know my dad was my dad until I was 10, so he wasn't really a parent until my teens. And I did all the sciences at school, and then when I left school, my first job was as a graphics artist for a publishing company. So, somehow whatever I did, my creativity kind of thrust its way through. And in my 20s, I started inventing things, and I spent 15 years. There's a microphone called the Seducer that was endorsed by people like Frank Sinatra. In fact, he wouldn't go on stage the last 2 years of his recording career unless that was on his piano. And Elton John, Moody Blues, Sydney
Wow.
Opera House, Royal Opera House, blah, blah, blah. And the other invention was
Well, wait, what did that invention
in
do? The Sinatra invention, what did it do?
it's a microphone. It's a contact microphone for pianos. You actually stick it to the underneath of a piano, and you can get studio quality stereo piano even if you're on the stage. So
Cool, very cool.
if you're videoing it, you haven't got sort of booms and microphones and things coming into the picture. And also, if you've got sounds going on outside, you probably might even have a drum kit next to you or something like that. None of that comes through. So, the engineers love it. You've got this separation of sound. And similarly in a studio, some studios that we supplied it to actually abandoned the big plexiglass boxes that they used to stick drummers in, That wasn't because they disliked drummers. That was to keep the sound out.
And you created it, why? Because you were interested in the electronics of it, or were you a musician? Like, what brought you to invent that?
I was actually. A friend of mine was a Latin Latin instrument percussionist. So he had bongos and congas and little things that he rattled and tapped and all that kind of stuff. Very, very good. I mean, he was really exceptional. But it was a very difficult situation to mic up because you've got the congas, which are down by your feet. You've got the bongos, which are sort of, up here somewhere. And it's very difficult. Your hands are in the way of the mic. The feet are in the way of the mic. And so you're ever kicking things and hitting things and all that. I originally invented the microphone to go inside the congas because unlike regular mics, it's quite happy to the sound pressure level inside a drum is quite high, and it would tolerate that where normal microphones wouldn't. And then it transpired, really, when I came to the States to open the subsidiary for that company, that the big market was in pianos. Every church in the Deep South has a piano that they're very, very proud of.
Right.
And, it was a very easy way of having them get a great piano sound without having to have somebody specialist to set it up every time.
Yeah, sure.
So that was when it became known as a piano mic. And then it just rolled on from there, really.
It is fascinating and very timely from my perspective, because you'll notice the silly guitars in the back, and I play in a, an 80s rock and roll cover band. However, I never realized until we started playing real shows how important having a sound person is to be able to hear yourself, really hear your bandmates, and then perform appropriately. So if you're solving that problem, that's pretty interesting. What was it in your childhood that shaped who you were becoming in ways that you didn't understand later? Like what was it that you mentioned your father wasn't involved? Unpack that for us.
Yeah, interesting question. And a question actually where the answers are evolving even month by month.
Yeah.
My mother and my father were never married, and my mother was a cook housekeeper. And back in the 1950s in England, cook housekeepers were employed by people who were, definitely in the upper crust. And so I was really a misfit from day one, because people who employed my mother were, they had sort of plummy Queen's English kind of
Push
ways of speaking,
against the push.
you know.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, and yet I went to the little um what you would call a public school down the road there, and all the little kids were, "Hey, they're speaking like farmers." They were country folk.
Yeah.
So, my ostracization from society started at a very early age. When I was, my mother was 25 when I was born, and my father was 60, and he had a family, way, way, way away.
Got it.
And so, rural England was not really prepared for an extremely artistic person, as my mother was, to spawn kids out of wedlock, and then it was, so when I was about 7, um, she was institutionalized.
No.
And we were paying the price really of not fitting in. That was the deal. And so several things happened really. One was I got to grow up pretty quickly.
Sure.
When we were reunited, I don't even remember. A lot of my childhood memories have been blocked out of my mind. But I sort of took over the role. Well, not took over because nobody else ever had it, but I adopted the role of looking after her in a way.
Mm.
And so there was until she married my first stepfather, when I was about 11.
Well, what happened to
I
you when she went away when you were 7? Who looked after you?
The local Roman Catholic priest and his housekeeper took me under their wing, and as did also the Roman Catholic convent. And I don't remember where. I remember most of my time I spent staying in the rectory, and they were most people. When I say Roman Catholic priest, they wince, But he was a truly wonderful man. But neither he nor his housekeeper, who had left Ireland at age about, I think, 14 to be his housekeeper. She was, that was probably 50 years earlier. Neither of them had any connection with kids at all. So suddenly, being dumped with a 7-year-old boy was quite clearly a bizarre experience from them. They had no idea how to deal with that. So I to some extent, I became a chameleon. I could adopt different kind of, social plumage depending on where I was. And that proved to be very very useful to me later in life. I had one particular task in my late 20s when I was mediating between a trade union and a large, Andre version 1, and then talking to the other side, I was Andre version 2, and so it was a useful trait. But it was the other thing that really occurred to me quite recently was I got to learn how to learn things very quickly.
Mm.
I had a large number of occasions when I had a swift learning curve. And so I really think that was a very useful trait. So a lot of these things that were a sort of dark cloud over me in some senses
Yeah.
had silver linings to them.
That's fascinating because I feel like that absolutely dovetails into your TED Talk. Does that sound right?
That's a great observation, Chris. It really is. Yeah. And I think, this notion that we can think either, convergently or divergently is a brand new thing that I've been working on. I mean, it's not a concept most people have, but it is a very, very powerful driver for a lot of the things that I'm doing and so forth. And I think you're absolutely right. When we have a brand new situation in front of us. Perhaps, I remember, in my early 20s when I hitchhiked to Greece, I went into countries that were nothing like the UK. And, I remember very clearly you've got to have a very divergent view of the world at that point. You don't, everything's unfamiliar. So, and you don't consciously think about it, but you have to have your eyes wide open. I mean, there's all sorts of rules and social norms that you're going to bump into that you're not familiar with. And, so that ability to keep an open, literally an open mind, but it's more than just the sort of open mind we normally refer to. I think you're absolutely right that everything that went on in my childhood really up until 11, 12 was a sort of day-to-day learning experience. And so I think I did get very used to having a divergent view of the world.
It's fascinating. Was there a moment when you were younger? It seems like you were kind of raised to be a creative thinker, but was there a moment when you were younger where somebody first rewarded your creativity or shut it down? Was there anyone that kind of flamed that creative fire for you?
I actually don't think so. No, I don't really believe there was. I played learnt the piano from a very early age, and I don't really remember doing other things. Occasionally, a piece of artwork. I just bumped into a painting that I did when I was like 6. It was oil. It was oils, which was what my mother painted in, and on canvas. And so I obviously did that kind of thing. And I imagine, as one always does when a child creates a piece of artwork, people patted me on the head and said, "Oh, that's beautiful." um, but I don't remember really anything, along those lines. As I say, a lot of what I went through when I was young, particularly the scarier bits, they've been eliminated from my memory, possibly forever. I don't dig around in there too much anymore. I've done many, many years of that, and I'm quite happy the way I am right now.
How has your background and your personal story shaped the way you understand things that you write about now, burnout, innovation, or the human mind?
Well, I think the fact that both of my parents, my father was actually becoming a world-renowned artist. So although I didn't know he was my dad at an early age, he was there and he made an impact. And clearly he was, he was somebody that was very special to my mother. In that sense, he had an impact, and in that sense, he was a role model. And then, I got to know him much better. He died when I was about 17, something like that. So having creative people around me made me to be attracted to creative people, and that's one reason why when I left school, I became a graphic artist, because the people I was working with were very creative people, and I felt very comfortable in that space.
Talk to us about
And
that. And talk to us about that period of your life. So you have this bumpy childhood, you go off, you become a graphic artist, and then what?
yeah, so well, that the graphic artist part turned through a bizarre set of circumstances into my becoming a journalist.
Well, let's hear it.
And it's the sort of thing that I don't think would sort of happen today, or it wouldn't have happened there in a sort of more normal setting. But the publishing company I worked for was a sort of close knit family, and their sort of HR policy when hiring people, number one was, are you in any way related to our family? And so you had all sorts of people in this company who were in positions where they had no previous experience at all,
Nepotism at its best, yeah.
including the publisher. And he was really an interesting character, I suppose, is the polite way of putting it. I mean, he was a Looney Tunes person. He would sort of have a meeting and, ask you a question. If you didn't like the answer, his hand would fly across the desk, and the lamp and the phone and his coffee and everything else would just sort of disappear everywhere. So he had a meeting with the editor and myself about the magazine we were working on. I was, doing all the layout and graphics, and Richard, the editor, said something or other that Harold didn't like. So but Harold basically said, "Oh, I've had enough of this. You're fired. You're fired."
Oh.
Well, he, yes. Who else does that remind you of? Yes, quite. And he had a habit of doing this, and generally speaking, he'd fire people towards the end of the week, and then Monday morning they were at their desks as if nothing happened, and that that was a sort of known phenomenon. Well, in this particular occasion, Richard didn't turn up on Monday morning. He said, "Okay, well that's fine." So, and he got his paycheck and disappeared, and that was it really. And so we kept in contact by phone. Anyway, I had gradually started to write bits and pieces for the magazine. And Richard had given me pieces to write that were, I don't know if it was actively in preparation for this moment or not, but the bottom line was when he left, I actually went ahead and carried on writing all the articles and doing the editorial, as well as the graphics. And about 3 months later, there was their quarterly sort of editors meeting, and I was sitting at the table, and the publisher, Harold, said, "Andre, what are you doing here? This is for editors." And so I sort of stumbled and stuttered a little bit, and then somebody, one of the other editors who knew the whole story, sort of chirped up and said, "Harold, Andre's writing the magazine." And Harold sort of didn't know how to take this, and he sort of stumbled and fell about. Anyway, the whole story spilled, where I'd be actually writing this magazine for 3 months.
Oh, wow.
And said, "Well, I had to do it. So you fired Harold. He hasn't been working here for 3 months." And Harold was like, "What universe have I suddenly landed in?" So I became a journalist through that, and I went on to write for other. The thing I did do, I stood up and said, "Look, this is the situation, Harold, and one thing I do request is that you officially make me the editor." And he rejected that, and I said, "Okay, well, I've got other jobs lined up." So no, we'll make you the editor. That's fine. And so I suddenly had credibility in that field. And I went on to, and that ability to write has been with me, all my life. I mean, I just, when I was doing my PhD, I was next to people in my cohort that have been struggling. They'd had writer's block to write their dissertation for, sometimes 12, 13 years. And I had just used to picture Harold, on my shoulder saying, "Andre, I've had an advertiser pull out, and I need 5,000 words by 5 o'clock.
Right.
And, that's what I pictured. And I would just sit there and I would write and write and write. And my friend and I actually broke the record in terms of being able to get our PhDs done in record short time, or the 5 years it was supposed to be, which was, unheard of. And so, and I love writing. as a way of clarifying my thoughts
Yeah.
and giving my thoughts framework.
Yeah.
And that have found to be incredibly powerful. And I think I will always carry on writing a lot.
Very cool. Um, so in your research, what's the most surprising thing we know now about how that creative thought actually works in the brain? Because in your TEDx notes that you had sent to me, you mentioned that fMRI scans show completely different neural pathways for creative versus analytical thinking. Can someone that might be listening to this, can they flip that switch intentionally? And if so, how?
Yeah, you can. There were several interesting things to me that came out of the whole fMRI part. In my first book, which I wrote in 2011, there was no fMRI. If there was at all, it was very much in its infancy. For those who are not familiar with it, it's functional MRI. Rather than sticking your head into a fixed MRI and watching a slice of what your brain looks like. fMRI is fascinating because you can actually look at how neural pathways light up in the brain as a picture of a cross section of the brain, and it's just amazing. So one of the interesting things when fMRI came out was that some of the things that I said in my first book turned out to be physical realities. And so that really kind of inspired me to dig a lot deeper and carry on. As these were not sort of, fairy tale theories. There was now reason to believe them. And it's in the early days of that too that people debunked the idea we have left brain and right brain in terms of, artistic versus logical deductive. So, we think about both those things, but we actually use parts of both sides of our brain to do that. And then added to that is the fact that the creative synapses, the creative neural pathways that light up when we're thinking or doing something creative, are the same ones that we use when we're thinking of something emotionally intelligent. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, well, that's very interesting. But it supported this notion that this is all to do with divergent thinking.
Right.
Because if you think about what emotional intelligence is, people with emotional intelligence are able to sort of stand back a bit and have a look at the big picture. This might look like a nightmare right now, but look, this is only one little blip in our path of life. Oh, okay, yes, you're right. That kind of thinking.
Right.
And that sort of went on in my mind. And something I should mention is that if social scientists are trying to measure creativity, it's a very difficult thing to measure. So they tend to use divergent thinking tests. To measure how creative people are being. So the notion that creativity and divergent thinking are connected is not my creation. And it's a well-established piece of social science. So that whole notion of creativity, by the way, doing something creative is scientifically associated with being happier.
That's interesting.
So yeah, it is. And sometimes people say, yeah, but, there are a lot of great authors that committed suicide. But anyway, that all gets more complicated.
Yeah, that's a little morbid, but that is interesting. It makes sense, right? Intuitively, I think people understand that when they're doing something creative, they're kind of shutting down their thinking monkey brain and they're doing the thing, right? They're kind of just painting and not thinking about painting. They're just painting, or they're playing. And I know that happens with me when I'm playing music. Is I don't think about every single note. I just play, and yeah, I could see that. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Are there? Sorry, continue. Keep going.
No, I totally agree with you. I think it's, and I think the other thing is, I don't know if you feel that in your guitar, but I had a jazz band when I was living in Portugal, and I'm a jazz flute player. And so, one of the things that I was thinking about there was the notion that you spend some of the time thinking and using your sort of more analytical brain, when you're doing your sort of regular playing of the music. But then when it's time to improvise, you've got to switch to this. This is where you create your brand. This is where you really kind of show your musical personality.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think the beauty for me was that all of this could come together to really take you to a different space. I then realized what Csikszentmihalyi said when he referred to flow in the context of creativity.
Mm,
And so I think that all these things come together to show that thinking is not a simple thing to analyze.
mm.
It's not a simple thinking is difficult to think about. And so you've
Mind
got
blown.
so many exactly that. I mean, you've got so many moving parts.
So what if somebody's listening to this and they're saying, "All right, I'd like to bring more creativity to my life because, this fella just said it's going to make me happier." What are things that people could do, or maybe what's one everyday behavior that people do unintentionally that shuts creativity down, and what can they do in order to open up their creativity on both ends?
Another great question. The creativity, if you wind the clock back a little bit, if you look at young kids, they are the epitome of creativity. They've got that. And if you think about it, adults, when we make decisions and analyze situations, our subconscious disappears off to its memory banks and says, have I ever seen anything like this before?
Mm,
If we have, then use that as the basis for what's going on now. And because it saves a lot of time and energy. Our brains spend a long time trying to be lazy.
yeah,
I mean, we try and
it's like a caching of a computer, right? It's the cache, like so that it'll open
exactly.
faster. Yeah.
Exactly that. And so that's what we do. But when we do that, I mean, as a kid, when you've got no memory banks when you're born. I mean, there you are. The hard drive is blank. So we add this stuff to it, and the more we add to it, the more we've got the capacity for the brain to say, okay, we did that before, and this is what happened. We'll do it again. Bam. And that, by the way, saves us an enormous amount of energy. This is sometimes known as system 1 versus system 2 thinking, and the difference between them is huge. I mean, the creative thinking actually uses as much energy as going for a stroll. I mean, it's 20%, typically 20% of the energy that our body uses is used by the brain with that sort of thinking. So it's not surprising that we're always searching for ways to be lazy, to be efficient.
I love it. Yeah.
So that stifles creativity because that stops us from looking at the big picture. We're looking at one piece of the picture, which is the little bit that says we did it before, we'll do it the same way again. We have always done it this way. It's not just a sort of phrase that people use. And you see that in industry all the time. We've always done it this way. Okay, well, the world has changed. Let's do it a different way. So the thing that really it undermines our motivation to be creative is this kind of structure. So the first thing we can do if we want to increase the creativity in our lives, our creative thinking, is that we can mix things up a bit. I mean, when we go to the restaurant, our favorite restaurant, we can choose something different from the menu. When I had a factory in England, I used to find different ways to drive from home to the factory.
Mm,
I mean, sometimes it was useful because, somebody's suddenly doing roadworks over here and you've got 3 or 4 different options of going through it. But, just really changing things up a little bit. And so although routine, I mean, we all humans need structure, and it makes us feel comfortable. It grounds us is the best way of putting it. But that aside, structure can also suppress all that creative thinking
yeah,
process.
so interesting. I feel like it reminds me of I had a gentleman, Dr. Howard Eisenberg, and he wrote a book called Dream It to Do It. And he posited something that kind of blew my mind. I think you're gonna be like, yeah, of course. But I had never heard it phrased this way, where he was talking about how myopic modern day scientists can be because they're saying, well, it wasn't proven through the scientific method. And he challenges that thinking in the scientific community and points to that the most incredible scientific breakthroughs involved creativity. That it was as simple as like, Einstein would go for a walk and come back. Or, before he'd go to bed, he'd think this thought, ask himself a question, go to sleep, come back and having had a dream about it. And that all of these things in our past, these major scientific breakthroughs, were not done through the scientific method to get to that
No,
answer. It was all born
absolutely.
from creativity.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely right. I think that's totally true, and that's something I had a lengthy argument about with my dissertation committee when I was at the university, because
So tell us.
you know it's my argument was you can look for a basis of logic, as in 2020 thinking, as to how something evolved, but I'm going to guess that 95% of the time, that is a complete red herring. That's a real misrepresentation of what really happened. I mean, it's a little bit like saying, brainstorming. We're going to sit down here, we're going to come up with all the ideas we can think of and write them on Post-it notes and stick them on the wall, and then we're going to choose the ones. That's not how actual creative people do things.
Mm.
They don't wake up in the morning and think, oh, I'm going to write down everything that I can possibly paint a picture of today. And then I'm going to throw away the ones that don't seem appropriate to. No, I mean, you don't do anything like that.
Okay.
So, one of the things that I focus on in my business consulting is talking to people about the fact that if you embed creativity as a core value in your company, you don't need to brainstorm. People will brainstorm. You can trigger people to brainstorm the instant they come through the front door.
I love that. I love that. I love that. So, and that's powerful, right? Saying, hey, we welcome creative thinking here. What are the tactical ways that a business could do that and execute that and sort of foster that? You're kind of like flaming the fire.
Well, if it depends on the size of the corporation, but if it's a reasonably large company, I worked with a publicly quoted company not far from here in the Reno area, and they were in an industry where creativity was vital. But the company, as is common in that industry, the company itself was not at all creative. They were highly structured. They were very traditionally created, and that the person that they employed to try and generate creativity into the company had a thoroughly miserable time with them. I mean, he'd been very creative in previous employment, but basically, from straight out of the get-go, they did not respect what he was capable of doing. They did not, as far as they were concerned. Okay. Well, it was window dressing for investors. Yes, we've got this great person we've spent a hell of a lot of money on, and he's going to be our creative kingpin. This is our solution for the next. And sure enough, within 18 months, it was quite clear he'd flatlined. I mean, the creativity just wasn't there. And when I talked to him, it became very obvious that he would be called into a board meeting. We're planning, we're going to do a strategic plan next 5 years. We need to know what you think is going to happen. He says straight out of the gate, he could tell by everybody's body language, that there might have been one person out of 6 or 7 sitting around the boardroom table who had any respect for what he was saying, who'd actually listened to him when they asked him a question and he answered. Most of them were down there writing notes that were, probably a shopping list or what they're going to do at the weekend. I mean, that's how it felt to him. So, it's one of the things that I do in a larger company is I look for champions.
Yeah.
If you've got sort of hold a workshop with 20 or 30 people, there will be 3, 4, 5 of them that get it.
Right.
And they're excited by it. And it's like, okay, I see why we need this.
Right.
And those people are the ones that are going to be, like a virus. They're going to take creativity into the structure of the company, because you can't do it on your own. I mean, you're an outsider to start with, and you can't be with everybody all the time to try and remind them that they need to get out of these old habits and introduce new habits that are conducive to innovation.
So I'm curious about this though, because you mentioned that creativity doesn't happen in brainstorming and all of that stuff. And then we've got our advocates that are excited about it, that are, embrace creativity, probably saying in that specific organization, gosh, we squeeze the life out of creativity here. Um, how do you bring creativity into the organization? Is it sort of like vertical by vertical, all right, the marketing team is going to do it this way, the sales team is going to do it that way? Or is it you have to define what creativity means for them? I feel like that's a really difficult task in an organization that you just articulated. And I'm just curious if there are tactical ways that somebody that's watching this could say, oh, I could take that from the doctor and I could implement it tomorrow.
It's a great point. No, I don't think it can be done piecemeal,
Yeah.
department by department, because in my experience that creates the opposite impact. Because if you take one department, let's say the marketing department, and you work with them, everybody else in the company looks at them and says, this is some newfangled kind of thing. I mean, this is like, we're all going to be singing Kumbaya, in the morning with our coffee, and it just gets it just gets mocked, and people don't see the value in it. What you really it's much easier if you start from scratch. You see some of the businesses, I mean, particularly sort of in Silicon Valley and, in the Googles and, those kinds of things, where you've got, for instance, you might have a big rec room that's got lots of musical instruments in it. And, if you've been working on this thing for 6 hours and you're just like, oh, this isn't happening, and you go and you play a bit of guitar or whatever it is, you do something different. Or, they might have very loose working hours, so you can basically, if you're going to if you're in the flow with something creative, you might work till 4 a.m, and then you might have a couple of days off. I mean, in other words,
Right.
removing structure.
Right.
The only company that Richard Branson had a dress code was Virgin Finance.
Right.
All his other companies, there was no dress code. Your personality was displayed through how you dressed and so on and so forth. And back then, you're talking that was quite an innovation.
Sure.
But they felt that if you're talking about finance, even then, you're not necessarily talking, about having to wear a tie all the time or have your jacket on all the time. I mean, but there was a dress code. But they just felt if you're in the era of banking, we need to play lip service to certain things. But so that ability to display your personality in every way possible is really crucial. And the other thing is, we're not so much now. People have learned the lesson, but there is still a tendency for people to micromanage. They've got the mindset where they just can't keep their fingers out of every little bit that's going on around them, and so that's a really a killer for creativity. You've got the notion where, yes, you've got this little creative bit, and then someone comes along and says, okay, we'll take that from you there, and we're going to give that to Frank. He can finish it off and all that. And it's like, well, that's like sort of sketching your picture and have somebody else, get the paints out and do the painting part of it. I mean, it's like, why would you want to do that again? I mean, it's just, it's just not conducive to the creative process.
So I guess what I'm hearing, which I believe, I agree with you wholeheartedly, is that it's almost like if you want to get fit, it's not about a diet, it's about your lifestyle, right? Like change the
Yeah.
entirety of the structure of the way you live life. And then healthy habits are kind of born from that. Cause I'm thinking about the most creative office that I ever visited my business partner and I were guests for Tony Hsieh at Zappos in Las Vegas. And man, oh man, I don't know if you've ever been to those offices, but every department, and you're right. Now that I think, as you were saying it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what they did. Because I remember they took us on a tour, and everybody on the tour, we were all entrepreneurs, and he had a program where he was trying to have people make downtown Las Vegas their headquarters, so he can kind of gentrify and revitalize that neighborhood. So my business partner and I were there because of my agency, and some of the departments had these crazy things where every 10 minutes an alarm would go off and then dance music would start for just 30 seconds. It'd go boom, 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 boom. And everybody kind of get up and start dancing, and they'd all be laughing, and then they'd sit back down. And I was like, I remember leaving and saying, I think that would drive me crazy. But those people seem to be having a lot of fun. And the woman giving the tour said, yeah, they just leave the door open to be creative, and then you can be creative in any way that you want. So if somebody was in that environment and didn't like it, they could pick up their desk and they can go sit someplace else, and it would be completely okay. That nobody would say, why are you sitting someplace else? You have to sit with Bob over here. That you can kind of find your spot that worked for you. Which it was kind of beautiful, frankly, because they had like hammocks set up, and there were people lying in hammocks with their laptops. They had
Yeah.
people, the call center people, there were a bunch of them that had treadmills on stand-up desks that were wearing like workout sneakers, and they were just walking while they were talking to people on the phone. Because the other part of it too that they mapped on and on top at Zappos was there was no time limit or constraints for a customer service call. And like they had a record of like, it was like 20 hours. Somebody had stayed on the phone with somebody for like 20 hours to resolve a problem. It was crazy. And they, welcome that. It's kind of like your example earlier. If you need to work until 4 a.m, great, but you can take a couple of days off as well and recover. Yeah. So it does come from the top down. It's interesting.
I do remember that. My office used to be in Vegas.
Cool.
And I visited it. I remember there was a guy there that had
I love that you
desk.
visited it. That's awesome. Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And but on top, he'd built a bunk.
Yeah.
So if he wanted to pull an all-nighter, it was fine. He just switch it off, crawl into the top of the thing, and
But it's so
and
great.
Was like I just thought that was so that kind of breaking down those walls, and so and that kind of thing is and you can see it making people feel happier.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, there was nobody that got there. I got there kind of early. And I don't even remember what time most people started, but it was, when people walked from the car park to the door, and I just kind of sat in my car and watched it for like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, they started to get cheery and happy, and they were chatting to each other, and it's like they were going to somebody's birthday party.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy, right? And I remember also thinking, we were congregating to go on the tour. I'm like, wow, this must be annoying. That like there's a tour going on through your office, but everybody's smiling at us, saying hello. I was like, wait, where are the cameras? Like somebody's watching them right now, but they definitely seemed genuinely happy. I guess that his book like that we were delivering happiness, so it was working. Okay, so that's great. I love that. So let's shift gears a little bit. Your Harvard Business Review article explores the paradox that we want to be unique as a human being, but we also want to belong. Which drive do you feel most pulled by personally? And 2, how do people reconcile that? Because I know that as I'm saying this, everybody's like, oh yeah, like I want to be unique, but I also want to belong. I don't want to be ostracized. Like how do you navigate that?
I think the most important thing is just to realize it exists. So, but there are a number of different ways. I don't know if you've heard of the Bloomsbury set. From the 1920s and 30s in England. There were a laundry list of really famous creative philosophers, writers, painters, blah, blah, blah. And interestingly, occasionally they were called the Bloomsbury Group, and they resented that brutally.
They wanted to be a
Yeah,
group. Because they wanted to be individuals.
exactly
Yeah.
that. So one way of navigating that process, and if you think back, you saw a lot of this. Well, there's no point in your thinking back, but if I think back, you saw a lot of this in the 60s and 70s. And one way is to create a group, but it's of the people who think in the way that you like to think. So, if you're let's just use the phrase free thinker.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a group of free thinkers, to some extent, you've overcome that dichotomy. But the other thing is you don't have to belong, you don't have to feel this affinity to be with other people at the same time that you feel the need to be individual. And I go back to the jazz again. You're playing the same chords, the same notes as everybody else, and then bam, you're going to switch to the individuality when you're improvising. And that's what we can do in life.
I see. Okay. It's a bit of a mind bender, actually. I think
It is.
like, you really kind of have to noodle on it. Like, so you're in the group, you've done sort of rote group, not creative work to get to the point to understand the music, read the music, play the music. You're with a group in order to perform and, I guess the mapping to a business, but then in order to riff and improvise, then you become an individual. Ha.
Yeah.
That's
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Do you know the guitarist, John Williams, not the composer, but the guitarist? He was a very famous English classical guitarist. He played classical Spanish guitar, blah, blah, blah. Very, 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 very accomplished. He started a band called Sky. And I got to know them quite well because they used my microphone, which works very well on acoustic guitar.
So cool.
And, in reality, and Sky was a sort of classical jazz crossover. And he was awful. I mean, had great people around him, but he could never get past that structure, And yourself with jazz, for instance, there's great power in just being slightly before the beat, slightly after the beat. He couldn't do it. He just couldn't do it. His fingers and brain were like sort of, I need to play this exactly, 4/4. I mean, we're not going to, everything's got to be. And so, it sometimes that structure can become too ingrained in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
I mean,
becomes
one of my clients was his dad was an accountant, a very, very, very powerful accountant, and he went and this guy went in through accountancy too, and he really, really wanted to become more creative, and so we worked together for a while, and he just could not introduce spontaneity into his life. I mean, we gradually got it so that he could see that it was a good thing to do, and that was the first stage. But becoming spontaneous, doing something that hadn't been planned for weeks or months, was just not in his vocabulary. And it was an interesting, very interesting lesson to see, because it was very extreme. And very detrimental to him. I mean, he was now coming up for middle age, and he felt like he didn't know who he was. Oh. And indeed, I can see why. I don't think, and more to the point, his wife didn't know really who he was. They eventually had been together a long time, but somehow or other, he was defined by structure and planning. And whatever was sort of inside there trying to get out never had a chance.
Wow, that's a shame. Are there times that you've worked with groups and where you've seen sort of that group has elevated an idea even further beyond what one person could do, and you were like, "Oof, they got it"?
It's an interesting question, and it really defines the difference between creativity and innovation, doesn't it?
How do you define
creativity? Well, I think being creative. First of all, I think the germ of an idea always comes from one person. And then And the innovation part of it is where the group becomes valuable, because they can take that idea, they can see different ways of actualizing it, they can build it into something different. And in reality, that's a different set of skills. So if you're trying to put together an innovative team, you really need three different sorts of people. You need somebody who they live and dream new ideas in their mind. And that was the sort of person that I was in my 20s. And to some extent, I suppose, having just, even in the 2000s, my ideas regarding creativity, spherical thinking, this, convergent versus divergent thinking, those kind of. So I guess I still got it there, but it was very obvious in my 20s because of my ideas and my patents and that kind of stuff. And so you need that kind of intuitive. I hate to use the phrase thinking out of the box because it's such a cliche. It's the very opposite to
the
anything
phrase is not
creative,
thinking.
isn't it?
It's true. Yeah, like that phrase is not thinking out of the box, but we're with you. We're with you. Keep going.
Exactly. You'll forgive me that one occasion.
Yeah.
And then after that, you need people that can be able to be sympathetic to that process and sympathetic to those ideas, but they then have to create some structure where it can actually become, for instance, a product, whether it's a physical product or, whatever it is. And then you need other people that have got things like consciousness about time. I mean, the world is replete with, engineering people who are still making this simple thing into something incredibly complicated. It's never going to get to market.
Yes.
Because,
yes.
it's too. So you do need these different sorts of personality involved in that process.
I do love looking at it like that, though, because I feel like sometimes, the engineers might feel left out in the creative conversation, but really what I'm hearing from you is it needs to be a collaborative effort, an environment where everybody could be creative. The germ of an idea comes from an individual, then placed into the group, and then the group can send it on its way in the right direction in order to become innovative. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Wow, I've never thought of it that way. So you wrote that most adults default to solving new problems with old mental models. How do we break free from that?
Well, I think that there has to be a bit of conscious effort involved there. But if you use these very simple day-to-day changes,
right,
to start the process of it, the two things that start to happen. One is that you start to realize that a little less structure is positive. And the second is you begin to stop making knee-jerk decisions when a challenge comes up, because it's those knee-jerk decisions that are when the subconscious gets in there quickly. I mean, just physically, that process. I call it the lizard brain. I think you called it the monkey brain, didn't you? Yes.
Yeah. Same thing, right? The oldest part of our brain. Yeah, that the fight or flight. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, that jumps in. I mean, physically, that jumps in quicker.
Right.
Without that part of the brain, you wouldn't be able to play table tennis.
Right.
Physically wouldn't be able to, because your reaction time is too great without that part. So that gets in there first. And then if the conscious mind says, oh, well, the problem seems to have gone away now, because the other guy, the old guy, has figured it all out. No, I don't need to worry about it. So, there is a way that you can train yourself to say, no, hang on just a second. I'm going to look at some options. And when this becomes really, really difficult is when we're under stress, because you get a phenomenon called seizing and freezing, whereby...
Talk about that. Please unpack that, because I was just gonna ask you, what is the hardest belief for executives to unlearn? And I feel like it's that. So,
well, no, I think you're probably spot on the money. But when we're under stress and we have a challenge, and seizing and freezing is a known social science phenomenon, but we grasp the first solution that comes to our mind, and we fail to look at any other solution. So if you think of that now in the context of convergent versus divergent thinking, what we're saying is that stress actually creates convergent thinking. And all these options that exist around the edge, we don't see it. The blinders are now on the racehorse, and you see one solution. You could see examples of this. The really dramatic example that comes to my mind is after 9/11, when the skies were suddenly staggeringly quiet, and there was no commercial flight. And if you look at what Delta Airlines, American, all the big airlines, with the exception of one, I mean, basically they went into panic mode. They fired a bunch of staff. They renegotiated union contracts. They got rid of some of their less profitable routes and all that kind of stuff. Southwest didn't do that. Southwest stood back and said, do we really believe that nobody's ever going to fly on a plane again?
Right.
No, we don't. So they soaked up some of those some of those routes that were sloughed off. And within 10 days, they'd announced a profit-sharing structure with their employees. And they got extra employees, rushing to them, and so on and so forth. It's a process whereby, I mean, you can see both sides of that process.
Yeah.
I mean, but the second process, the Southwest solution, requires that you stand back a bit and you say, okay, this is a disaster, but first of all, it's very likely that the government will step in and help the airlines. They're not going to see all their major airlines go under. Secondly, yes, we will get back to flying a bunch of people around, even if it takes 6 months, even if it takes a year. We'll find other ways of doing it. And other ways included, taking some of the goods being shipped around the country away from the trucks into the airlines. We do it quicker, we can do it cheaply. We just need to get some sort of income. So there's all sorts of things that went on there behind the scenes that were part of that kind of process. But you can see the difference between stepping back and saying, let's have a look at the whole picture, as opposed to, I'm in panic mode. What are we going to do?
It's so interesting. I'm like, oh, where were you a year and a half ago in my life, man? That's that. As you're saying it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what happened. That's absolutely what happened. It is, and I'm sure people listening or watching are probably cherry picking moments in their life where they, how did you say it? It's seizing and freezing, where you kind of the first answer that comes to mind. I seized, I didn't freeze. I kind of seized and then ran the wrong idea off a cliff, and then realized the consequences. I was like, oh no, climb back up the cliff, go back to the beginning, seized another idea, went off the cliff down.
Yeah.
and
you can see how that process, you can see that process in everybody that has anxiety, high degree of stress, or burnout. And that process is one of really extreme convergence. And unfortunately, it's all a matter of feedback within the system. Everything you're doing is making the situation worse.
Yep.
And so, that's why it's crucial to get them out of that, get them to step back, stop looking at the world through a microscope and look at it through a wide-angle lens. And that's about introducing divergent thinking into their lives. And it's incredibly powerful when you're dealing with people with burnout. And I don't know if you've ever been unfortunate enough to suffer burnout.
100%. And that's a year and a half ago, I was let go from my job, dealing with the stress of that job had run me into the ground for 3 years. I don't think I realized I was burnt out. And then it was kind of like, hey, I'm exhausted, but I've got to feed my family. So we're going to deal with that later. And it was the seize and freeze, like, let's grab that thing and go. And it was a disaster. It's been a disaster. To be honest with you, this was born from me taking 10 steps back and saying, really challenging myself, saying, what do you want to do? What are you good at? And what can you bring to the world? And it's this podcast, truly. Like, that's how I came to creating the Quantum Shift podcast, was finally, after too much time and feeling ridiculously, I mean, I didn't realize, I had no idea. And then it just started manifesting in all these weird ways. It was like cuckoo. Yes, I've been burnt out. But unpack that for everybody that's listening. So if they're feeling burnt out, you go talk about being burnt out.
Well, I think you've done a great job there of using, that blinkered analogy with seizing and freezing. But I think, as you know, burnout, burnout. The word burnout is quite often thrown around as how are you today? I'm feeling burnt out. And people who use that phrase do not understand what really happens in burnout. I mean, it is so devastating. We don't know how many people had burnout that end up committing suicide, but it is a significant number. The reason we don't know is because the medical profession doesn't accept burnout as an identifiable disease. They prefer to subsume it under the heading of work-related stress. And that's so wrong on so many different ways. If I get a burnout client, the first thing I ask them is, so why now? Why are you coming to see me now? What's changed in your life in the last year? And they'll come up with various little bits and pieces. But when you put it together, the actual stress they're under didn't change that much. Now, not always the case. And it wasn't necessarily the case when I had burnout. But when I think about it, maybe it was. But so what changes is the fact that we're no longer able to deal with the stress.
Yeah.
And so, I redefine stress here as a challenge for which we do not have the resources to deal. So it's a little bit, it becomes a situation. The reason that that's important to reframe that whole process is because if it's work-related stress, it's tempting to think, okay, well, it's all down to work. I'm okay. It's all down to my work.
Right.
Whereas reframing it to say that we do not have the resources to deal with that stress now shares the blame, if you like.
Right.
It moves it to the point where we have to look inward and do something about it. We can't just get another job.
Yeah.
We have to participate in the solution as opposed to it being something to do with our work-related
I love
environment.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I want to high five you. And so, because of the conversations that I've been having, I always land on what you just said. I said, I spent a year, and I was like, wait a minute, I got to look in. And that's the only way to solve it. And it brought me back.
Absolutely.
Brought me back to meditation, brought me back to getting into the gym, brought me back to having really looking in. And I'm like, and then all of a sudden, slowly things started to blossom again when I started fixing in here. So you went through burnout. How do you allow, what do you advise your clients in order to, once they start looking in, then what?
Well, I think the second way, by the way, that description, the medical definition is rubbish, is that it might involve work, but that doesn't mean that when we leave work, we leave our burnout behind. Our burnout, it can also be, it's the whole of our life. And so the reality is, and one of the things, and I don't know if this is true for you, it's true for all, without exception, my burnout clients, and it was true for me, is you have a tendency to push away those very people who could help you.
Oh my God. I stopped doing everything. I stopped playing with the band. I stopped going to my gym. I've sent my daughters and my wife on 2 separate trips without me, and I locked myself in this house. And it was the worst thing I could have done. Yeah.
So I'll add you to the list of people who would agree with that statement.
Yeah. What is that about us? I mean, my perspective was sort of a blinded really, I wish there was a better word, was just dumb perception of I'm the dad. I have to handle it. I'm the man of the house. I have to handle it and figure it out on my own. And, that was obviously wrong. What do you think that is about us as human beings?
Well, I think there are a couple of things really. One is that this high degree of convergence, which comes with burnout, makes everything else a worthless distraction. So everybody that's not in that field of vision, and that field of vision for most people is simply you. Everybody outside is they're sapping away energy I need for other things. They're sapping away, and most of the most important issue that we have is our emotion. And
Because it's funny, I didn't really perceive it as burnout. It was like, this is a big emergency and I've got to handle it. And yeah, closed everything out. And the idea that everything else outside felt like a distraction um, almost angered me. I would say to anybody that would listen, like, I want to go to the woods by myself for 2 months and figure this out. Like, I just didn't want to do anything. And then I realized through dear friends reaching out who were kind of like, you need to go to the gym, you need to play your music, you need to. Once that started happening slowly, I was like, okay, now I feel like myself again. Wow, that's important.
the other thing
Yeah,
that makes that kind of particularly poignant is that, how when you get like flu or something, any weaknesses in your body start to show up. Like, if my knees start to ache,
Mm.
well, it's flu, for God's sake. I mean, what's that got to do with my knees? But burnout tends to have a similar kind of thing. So if you have a tendency to be controlling, burnout will make that extreme. And if you have a tendency to overwork, burnout will make that extreme, because you're homing in on what you think are solutions to your problem. And quite often that is that you need to work harder. I've got this problem because I just, the only way out of this is that I work harder. It's what I always do when I have a problem. I work harder. And so, this is another of those horrible feedback loops.
Yeah.
Where you're getting worse and worse and worse. I was very lucky at one point in my burnout. My burnout was huge.
Please, yeah.
I was running my
I was
business.
gonna say, explain
business
that,
in
because I want to know how you pulled yourself out. So tell us about the burnout and how you got yourself out of it.
Yeah, I won't bore you with all the details of how it occurred, but there were two things that happened in my life at once that were major at a time when it was particularly important. I was doing like 6 trade shows in a row every summer. I'd start in McCormick Place in Chicago. I'd have to go to London, to Earl's Court. I'd go to the Music Messe in Frankfurt. I had a medical and a music one in Tokyo. And then I'd come back to LA and then Atlanta. And that was my summer. And I would just finish the first setting up in McCormick Place in Chicago. And it was going to be big. We got new products, so we'd spent some really serious money on this booth. And my manager from Florida was going to come up and be on the booth as well. Literally, it was just about to open. I had 2 phone calls. One was from a hospital in England with my mother bursting into tears because my stepfather had died. And the second, about an hour later, was from my secretary in Florida saying that my manager hadn't showed up for work for 2 days. Now, Peter was, he actually was an alcoholic, but he'd been dry for like 3 years. And I guess, he went grocery shopping and all these bottles of wine happened to fall into his cart. But so those are the 2 things. That meant Peter wasn't going to come up to Chicago because he was in a mess. And suddenly, and I had mother to deal with by some means or other. I'm an only child and she's got no siblings, she had no other siblings in her life. So, I was the only person. So anyway, all that the excitement that my entrepreneurial 15 years had built up to just almost instantly. It was like there was a razor blade, and this side was excitement.
Yeah.
This side was everything else. Now, so it burnout for me just escalated incredibly quickly. Um, I systematically pushed everybody away from my life and, stopped going to see people I'd go to see for breakfast and blah, blah, blah. And persuaded my wife to go back to England. She was English at that time, my first wife. And there was one person that resisted that, and he'd call me up and I said, look, I just can't deal with this now. Can we leave it a couple of weeks? Damn me, in the morning, he'd show up with some croissants and some coffee and say, hello, Andre, just bought us some breakfast. I thought we'd chat a little bit. And it didn't matter what I said. There was always tap, 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 tap on the door at some point during the day, and he'd come in and like day 3, 4, something like that. We were talking a couple of weeks. Anyway, he gave me a piece of paper and he said, I want you to call Dana. She is a meditation teacher and I think she can help you. And I did call her and I held myself together sufficiently to, go to start the meditation, to learn to meditate. And the first night after the first day of the 3 days of learning to meditate was the first time I had slept well for literally probably 3 years.
Wow.
And it was, and so as a consequence of that, I've been a meditator for now 40 years. And that was an incredibly powerful thing. Now, there were lots of other things that happened that came from that. But, the crucial part of it really was a sense of grounding that meditation gave me. Sleep.
Yeah.
I mean, from being just brutally sleep deprived, I was suddenly like sort of, oh, okay, what's this feeling? Oh, you know what? Feeling you've got energy. It's like, you're missing that sort of, oh God, is it morning?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it was just incredibly powerful. And in the course of time, meditation also helped me become resilient because, not one of that statistic, 50% on average of people who have burnout have it recur within 18 months.
Wow.
And, which is another frightening part of the whole row of statistics. But that really helped me in many, many different ways. But I think the other thing which you alluded to was I really cut out to do what I'm doing? I mean, I sometimes, integrate something into my talks and webinars and stuff that, the incredible benefit that human beings have is that we are very pliable, very flexible. We can accommodate. We're very accommodating in the way that we live. And the real disaster that we human beings have is that we're able to accommodate many things. We're very, very pliable. We're very, and the net result of that, and I've seen this so much in coaching, is that people, especially perhaps in their 20s, they will be on a career path that appears to be towards their goals. And the goals that you have in your sort of, let's say, early 20s are not necessarily terribly enlightened. They may not be aligned terribly well with your own personal intrinsic goals as they should be. And so, by the time 35 comes or something, it's like, I've been an accountant for how long? God, if I see another set of figures, I'm going to, just they're in the wrong channel.
Yeah.
And I think to some extent that was true for me. I mean, my businesses were very successful. I won awards for marketing and exports and various other things. And the bottom line was, I don't think I really had the optimal personality type to do what I was doing.
Yeah.
And so it was, it sounded as if that kind of aha thinking, was something that you also can relate to.
100%. And sort of the meditation was a key part because one of my dear friends that had reached out, I had a handful of friends that wouldn't let me, kind of like your buddy that would tap, 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 pushed me to get back into meditation and reading the right books as well, book recommendations to kind of get myself out of my own head. And then the courage, which, was a running theme through all the books that I was reading, the courage to be able to be honest with yourself and really select the things that you love doing and that you're good at doing. And it didn't mean do a completely different career. I'm still running my running Torque AI and doing marketing consulting, etc. But doing it in such a way that fits me, and it's not like, oh well, I have to do all of these other things as well because that's the way to do it. And even though it's painful and awful, but the courage to say, well, I'm not going to do that. This is where my expertise lies, right here. Because I remember, I had a conversation with my friend Mike Sprouse, who's an author as well, and he was like, oh, congratulations about all these great things that he saw. I was like, oh dude, I'm doing a lot of this, but I'm not doing any of this. And that was like the kickoff to everything that changed. Was like me, like him sort of being that mirror that held up to me, where I was kind of like, oh yeah, I'm not doing that. And that's where the joy and the happiness and where creativity really starts to flow and those things happen. So I do think it's an important, really important conversation. I've never really had this discussion in terms of around burnout. And yeah, I went through everything that you just said, almost embarrassingly so. And I think that that's also a thing too that comes up. I'm sure there's a layer of shame, which is an intense word, but there really is. There's a layer of shame where you're like, oh, I'm not going to do the thing I was doing before. And, I can't handle that stuff anymore. It's a bizarre hodgepodge of things to be in. But I think of it this way. You and I would not have had this conversation had I, not gone through all those steps. And had you not been burnt out and I not been burnt out, we wouldn't be wouldn't be here, going deep dive on these things. So I guess there's a good thing, the good point of it. I do think meditation is the anchor to everything, though. Absolutely. So what?
I think it really is, and it's so interesting to me that if I have a problem or a challenge, and it's not something that has to be done like today, and I have it in my mind, the solution will come to me sometime in the next 10 days, 2 weeks, at the end of or during a meditation.
Yes. Yes.
So I think, meditation, going back to the previous area of conversation, meditation is inherently a divergent exercise.
Mm.
And it really helps you become creative because it's got no, it, the power of meditation comes from the fact that it is structure free.
Mm.
I mean, even if you've got a mantra or you listen to your breath or whatever it is, I mean, the general rule, as I understand it, certainly the meditations that I've done, are that you don't guide them. You just are.
Yeah.
You use the opportunity to just be.
Yeah. I am.
And so you've got that really beautiful structureless process. And that in itself is a very powerful way of helping you just get over the process of structure.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. I think it's interesting. What's popping into my head is my father-in-law has a practice of prayer, and he will sit by himself and he will pray for hours. My mother does the same thing. My mother-in-law does it as well. And I think their generation, they don't label it as meditation. They're talking about prayer and praying the rosary or doing whatever. It really is meditation, right? Like sort of being as present in the now, thinking, I forget the name of the meditation, but like wishing people well in your life and wishing them love and happiness and success. And that's what you're doing when you're meditating. So it's,
Yes.
it's a fascinating thing. So you go through this awful burnout moment, you get spit out the other end. Then what happens?
Well, that was really the start of my decision to sell my businesses. I just realized that, and the timing was not stunningly great. I mean, this was the time when the businesses were really beginning to take off. So a good business person would have said, 5 years time, and you're going to have things that you can really make a significant living from. But that wasn't to me an option. The option, that my thinking was, life has to change. I mean, but when I fell over one side of that razor blade, and the excitement was there, and the whatever burnout was this side. There was no going back.
Yeah. Oh,
I
100%.
mean,
Yeah, I mean, that's why I call this the quantum shift. I refer to it as quantum shift. You're talking about the razor blade. Absolutely no going back. Yeah. So,
yeah. So I basically I sold the medical business. I sold the audio business. And I went to my first wife. The deal was that if I got rid of the businesses, we'd go back to Europe. It didn't have to be England, but she wanted to go back to Europe. She never really felt comfortable in the States. So we went to Portugal, and I designed and built my bucket list home.
cool.
And it was a very interesting experience. I mean, it was a very advanced home for its time. I mean, there was, first of all, it's in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So,
Love that.
there were several points. I mean, when I needed concrete pouring, that was like really keeping your fingers crossed whether the concrete truck could actually get down the road.
Wow.
And so forth. But you're talking back in the 90s, I had two huge racks of solar powers, tracking solar panels. The water was all solar heated. One of the rooms was a hot rocks room. And in the winter, the doors would open, the sun would heat the hot rocks, and then warm air would circulate through the prior house in the evenings. It was an interesting
that's so cool.
experiment.
That's like, there's a show like that on architecture. I forget the name of it, but they always show these incredible architecture. Were you always interested in architecture and different aspects of a home like that? Like,
yeah, I always have been. I think it's in a different life. The trouble with architecture as a career is that you spend your first 10 years, designing the public lavatory block on the edge of the park. I mean, you don't really get to do interesting things until your name is in lights. But I've always been interested. And this was a wonderful experience. There's a video you can watch on my website that shows the whole house.
oh yeah, I want to see that.
I bought the solid wood flooring from a 19th century schoolhouse in England because I wanted wood floors. With the climate, that particular climate, I needed something that was very old wood. Otherwise, it would buckle and stuff. It was an amazing experience. So that was my sort of major change. Building that was a 2-year project. And one of the things, going right back to the very beginning of what we talked about, one of the things that was very upsetting to me was that when I finished that house, and it had so much of me in it. All the windowsills, the front door was all pottery that I had made. And when I finished that house, I didn't feel like I owned it. I felt like I was the gardener. And it was very, very upsetting to me. It just felt like somebody else's house.
Why?
I think it was because being, my mother being a cook housekeeper in everybody else's house, I was always, the phrase in England is below stairs, because originally the servants would live in the basement. We lived in the very top of the house, but it was just the fact that the house I lived in, I couldn't wander around the house when I was a kid. There were very distinct limits to the areas of the house that I could wander into.
You didn't feel
And
worthy of the house? Is that?
Exactly that. Yeah, I just did not feel worthy of owning that house. And now that got eroded by a number of very positive things. One was a few years later, about 5 years later, I went back to school and did my PhD.
How old were you?
And was that?
How old were you when you did that?
I was 45.
Wow, I love that. I love that because you know what? When we were talking earlier and you were explaining how when people are selecting their career, a story popped into my head from my father where he had a friend that in his 40s went to law school. And his line to my dad, and my dad shared with me, which I thought was brilliant, was this gentleman said, "I'm the victim of the decision of an 18-year-old as to where he was in his career in his 40s." And then he went back to law school. So that's okay. So unpack that. So you're in your 40s and then you go to work on your PhD. That's so cool. Well, tell us that.
Well, it was amazing. I don't know why. It was a bit weird because the millennium, my coaching, well, my consulting work had come to a halt. My second wife, we weren't married actually at that time, but I divorced my first wife and was now living with the person who would become my second wife. She was just at the point where she was going to sell her house as a function of the divorce. And we took a truck and a fifth wheel trailer, and we went down to the Baja, Mexico for 6 months. And we'd literally just, back up the trailer to the Sea of Cortez, and we would it was just a stunning experience. And so we were actually planning to do that. I'd become a scuba instructor when I lived in Florida.
Cool.
She was a massage therapist, and our plan was to actually travel. I mean, just carry on traveling. And for some bizarre reason, I had a sort of an informal interview at the University of Nevada, Reno, with somebody in their business school. And he basically sort of, towards the end of the 6 months, we've probably been in the Baja for about 5 months, I got this email saying, if you're still interested in a place in our PhD program, social psychology PhD program, we're offering it to you. And so it was like, whoa, okay, let's back up the truck a bit here. And so I just felt it was sort of my last opportunity to really do some sort of serious in-depth study. My first degree was a distance learning degree, and that was spread over sort of 10 years while I was running my businesses. That was like sort of, just something I just would do while I could still earn some money. So I'd never actually been full-time to university. And social psychology just, in the course of my business and in the course of the consulting work that I'd done after that business, I just realized that the big asset in a business is the human aspect, the human asset. And I wanted to know more about how people think and how all that is. And it was just a fabulous program, very eclectic. I mean, there were, you had input from, judicial studies, from women's studies, from, and the business school. And there were just so many, so you could choose anything you wanted to. I mean, basically. And so, for most people who were younger, that was a challenge. I mean, suddenly you're in a structure-free environment. These are the courses you can take, but when you get to do your dissertation, I mean, it could be on anything.
Sure.
From, gerontology to, studying young kids to studying the, juries, how juries make decisions in the law. I mean, it could be anything.
Yeah.
And so, but for me, that was great. And I just homed in on creativity, and homed in on an organizational aspect of creativity, how creativity works within an organizational context. And so, it was just wonderful. It really just exploded from there, in that shortly after I graduated, before I graduated, I started being a consultant for the National Judicial College, and they had wanted somebody to start a program that was going to be funded by a very wealthy person down in Las Vegas. They wanted a program to help kids learn about the law. There was sort of if you got a general, ask kids about the law, there would be one of the images they would have of, I think it was Martha Stewart, wasn't it, who was done for fraud, and she was basically, she just had to basically have an ankle bracelet on and stay at home, and these kids are thinking, well, that sounds okay. I can play my Game Boy all day, I mean,
Yeah.
so kids had a rather warped view of the realities of the legal system. So I started that nonprofit organization, Project Real,
Oh, cool.
Relevant Education About the Law, and that I ran that for 2 years in Vegas. That was never my life's work. So I got people who knew more about the American high school system and who had also been, fundraising in nonprofits and all that kind of thing. I put those together, and once that was all running and smoothly, and it still is running very well, actually. So which is kind of rather rewarding. And then I basically said goodbye and went over to Portugal, and we then lived in the house that I'd built. And so in the course of that, I was appointed as the visiting professor of creativity and entrepreneurship at Newport Business School in Wales.
Oh, cool.
And that was very, very exciting. That enabled me to make design executive development programs that were used with the Virgin Group, Lloyd's Bank, the
Wow.
Smithsonian.
Wow.
Smithsonian was that was a big workshop I did there. That was just spectacular, and various other things. So it was a very, very, very rewarding. The whole thing was really a very rewarding experience. I've never, I mean, clearly, from my latest books and that kind of stuff, I mean, this is something that seriously changed my career route.
Absolutely. And I feel like you're, not to get woo-woo, but you're living your dharma. Like, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're put on this planet to do.
Yeah.
So now that we're kind of coming to a close here, I don't want to keep you for too long. I feel like I've enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you for being so open and
Well,
honest
thank
with
you.
everything. What's next for you, and what's, if there's any parting wisdom that you want to share with the Quantum Shift audience, what would it be?
Well, I think one of my goals really is to get the appropriate stages to spread the word that reposition creativity in people's minds. It says creativity to people, and it generally creates a sort of recreational, maybe the thing that Aunt Dottie did when she retired from teaching and bought a paint box. I mean, all sorts of things and really it is so much more than that. I mean, it is, from the bow and arrow and the wheel to, spacecraft and the internet, it is the source of our social evolution. I mean, we don't have the iPhone and the internet because we've got opposable thumbs.
Right. Right.
We have them because in our innate drive as human beings, one of those drives is to create, is to make our world better. I mean, as I say, you can go right back to the bow and arrow and the axe. That made life a little bit better for Ugug and his family. And so, similarly, what we do now. So, but the balance between creativity, creative thinking and logical deductive thinking, there needs to be a balance. We need to incorporate both of those in our lives. And we don't really do that right now. We're so technologically oriented. And, I remember as a kid and like you, I was plugged into a guitar amp in somebody's garage.
Yeah.
And, and I was a pretty competent musician and passionate about it. But you wouldn't dare to suggest to anybody related to your parents that you were going to
Become a musician. Yeah.
become a musician. I mean, you just
It
weren't,
didn't.
and it's like, as I said in my, TEDx talk, I mean, it's like, somebody, your uncle would sort of get on his hind legs and say, you do know the difference between a musician and a large pizza, don't you? I mean, at least the large pizza can feed a family of 4. I mean, it was treated, I mean, not just about music, but I mean, whether, going into writing or going to become a painter or whatever, it's treated with derision. So we've really lost that balance between creative thinking and deductive analytical thinking. Or to put it another way, we've lost the balance about being able to think divergently as well as convergently. And so I believe it's the root of so many of the problems that we have now. I mean, if talking about, from ADHD, and I've coached ADHD clients, right up to stress and burnout, how we deal with stress and burnout. And it's a lot of that is to do with that lack of balance. We need both bits. We need something that says, it's a good idea if we get the mortgage paid by this date, otherwise bad things will happen. We need that degree of sort of organization and planning. And this isn't about lacking any of those things, but we need to be able to have the ability to think creatively about our lives, about the world around us, and how we fit into it, and how our brains really want to fit into it, how our individual personalities want to be within this world. And so, it's that repositioning of creativity, of creative thinking, I should say, that is, I think, very important.
I agree. Wow. Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been a joy of a conversation. I greatly appreciate it. I will put all of your links to the TEDx talk, your website, your consulting, everything in the description of the video on YouTube.
Yeah, I've got I'm launching 3 programs to help people with anxiety and burnout. The 2 of those programs have been launched. I can give you the links to those. And then there is a very a less expensive program, which is something that people can work on their own. It's a 6-module program. And it has as a workbook for each module, there's a video for each module, and it basically helps people go through the processes that we've alluded to here. I don't recommend it for people with serious burnout. I think the one-on-one aspects of the other 2 programs is very important. In those programs, I actually custom build 3 different sort of sub programs within it to the 3 R's, which deal with recreation, relationships, and responsibilities. And those are 3 things that we work on, on those programs. So the inexpensive program is very useful for people who just they feel stressed, they feel as if they might be on the edge of burnout, and it will also introduce them to all these topics. So that's something that I'm really trying to push, because the incredible increase in burnout, numbers of people that have burnout. I mean, the last figures were that somewhere between 50 and 70% of all adult American people will have do that, and that's actually a global statistic as well.
Yeah, it's a little scary, actually. I feel like
it is.
It's kind of like the universe being like, "Hey guys, you're doing it wrong."
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the doing it wrong is just having this imbalance in what it is we're really doing and thinking about.
Well, I thank you for sharing your work and your mind and your journey. I think you're doing incredible work. Keep up the good work. And thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been a joy, a real joy. Thanks so much for watching the Quantum Shift podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, like, comment, and share.